Oscar Micheaux begins his life in Metropolis, Illinois, on January 2nd, 1884. During this time, his parents Calvin and Belle Micheaux were only just slaves in Kentucky. In order to give him a better life, they moved across the Ohio River to Illinois, where Oscar was born in 1884. During this period, the family grew wheat and corn on an 80-acre farm. After working on the farm and doing hard work for the majority of their lives, Oscar began to work hard in various jobs around Chicago, including as a Pullman porter. Pullman porters were people who carried bags for wealthy train riders. Around this time is when Oscar begins to realize, like many other black homesteaders, that the idea of land ownership, political and social freedoms, rights, and especially respect were the real goal. For Oscar Micheaux, it was no longer about the money that he earned doing the services that he provided. It was now about how he can prove himself as a real African-American worker. Around this time, President Abraham Lincoln declares that all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. This is a monumental decision for the Lincoln administration because it began to open up doors for Oscar and those around him. Now, Oscar and those around him looked to build a new life. He wanted to provide for a family and educate his children. Out of this, his aspiration to own his own land was finally within reach. In 1904, Oscar travels to South Dakota to participate in a lottery run by the General Land Office. If he wins, he may even be able to be the new owner of his very own land, a feat he imagined impossible. With more than 100,000 people trying to claim only 2,400 plots of land, he didn't get his hand in the jar quite quick enough for the lottery drawing and instead hired a land locator. This land locator would cost Micheaux a staggering $80. Today, this amount would equal about $2,667 with inflation. But he finally obtained what he wanted, the Promised Land. This land would be located in Rosebud Indian Reservation. Despite his best efforts, his first year didn't reflect the Promised Land success that he had earned. Instead, he dealt with a 3-year drought that destroyed most of his crops, but this only fueled his efforts to become successful. He develops a grudging respect, then to acceptance, and finally to admiration when they finally realized that he had broken more acres of prairie than most of them. This is talking about the white landowners around him, and they began to respect him. With more respect coming from the hardworking farmers who were white around Micheaux's farm, he began to feel more confident. This made him feel more at home on his own land, something that not many people could feel. Around this time, Micheaux develops feelings for a local white woman. Knowing a feeling like this could take everything he had earned away from him, he makes sure to stay away in order to not cause any potential problems. Later, in 1910, Oscar would marry a schoolteacher named Orlean McCracken. Together, they would parent Orlean's daughter from a previous marriage with a reverend from Chicago. Oftentimes, Oscar would travel for work, leaving Orlean to feel abandoned and alone, which is capped off by a miscarriage while he was away. Orlean's family wasn't particularly impressed with Oscar's support of their daughter and began to sell his belongings while he was gone in order to pay for the land that Oscar was living on. Essentially, they sold all of his belongings in order to buy his property. With much effort, Micheaux tried and failed to get Orlean back, as well as his land. This would result in divorce in 1917. In an effort to help himself feel better, Oscar begins writing down his experiences as a homesteader, as a way to make himself feel better. The things that he wrote were a mix of fiction and biography meant to tell the story that he struggled with. After not much time, he soon created a full-length book of his experiences that he titled The Conquest. This would be his first book that he had put out and his doorway to the rest of his life. After the book is put out, he finally begins traveling throughout the region to sell the book to his friends, neighbors, and anyone he thought would want to buy it. Soon, this would lead to a second novel titled The Homesteader. Homesteader becomes more of a recognizable title when you're talking about Oscar Micheaux. More importantly, the creation of these two books caught the attention of a production company that wanted them to be turned into a movie. Finally, in 1919, he adapted his story into his first film and became known as the first African filmmaker and director. The Homesteader, in 1919, was considered to be the film that launched Micheaux's career. Over the next 30 years, he would make more than 40 films, and his work would be preserved by the Library of Congress and the National Film Registry as historically, culturally, and aesthetically significant. His films featured contemporary African-American actresses and actors, and his work highlighted and worked to combat racism and racial inequality. Finally, in real films, African-Americans were taking the roles of doctors, businessmen, detectives, and lawyers, all high-status jobs. He even provided a window that people could see into the life of a hardworking African-American. Finally, after a lonely life without his former wife Orlean, Oscar Micheaux would remarry in 1926 to an actress named Alice B. Russell. She would soon appear in 6 of his films. Following a long life of filmmaking, Oscar Micheaux would finally pass away of heart failure on March 25, 1951, at the age of 67 in Charlotte, North Carolina, while he was away. Oscar would be buried in Great Bend, Kansas, with his tombstone reading, "A Man Ahead of His Time."